Okay, let's get started here. My name is Taylor Stuckey, and I am a business teacher at McPherson High School.
My name is Lindsay Miller, and I'm a business teacher at Winfield High School.
My name is AJ Simon, and I'm an industrial arts teacher at Wakefield High School.
And my name is Stacy Tidmore. I am a reading teacher at Manhattan High School, and I will begin our conversation today with a little introduction to the topic of trauma-informed instruction. We are in a situation today in education where as public educators, we're mandated to teach everybody who comes through our doors. And many of these students show rising populations of anxiety disorder, suicidality, as well as depression. At the same time, we have breakthroughs in brain science and medical science that gives us more information about what's actually happening in people's heads. In her TED Talk, Nadine Harris discusses the best clinical practice that she developed with her patients. And I mention this only because it creates a context for this idea that we're using as we teach students today. And it's really based on the evidence that she discusses about when people go through trauma or adverse childhood experiences, that those experiences affect people's brains, and in doing so affects their ability to learn. When a child has a stress response that is agitated very often, and they're dealing with chronic stress, they have a situation where they're not able to learn as well as they could if they weren't in that brain place. So in the video that talked about the learning brain versus the stress brain, we learned that children with a learning brain are able to be calm and curious and playful and make mistakes without all the negative self-talk that a child who's in survival brain might be going through. Survival brain kind of discusses when a kid is just trying to get through the day. They just do assignments to finish them rapidly. And they feel like they are hyper focused on threat, and they're always looking to protect themselves. What we as educators are trying to do with this information is figure out how can we interrupt the progression of this in children? How do we not re-traumatize kids in our classrooms? And that's what this video will be about today. One side note about this, I'm currently reading a book called The Coddling of the American Mind: How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure, as part of a book study in my school. And the authors do discuss the concept, the term trauma, and how there's been some cultural creep with that term in terms of it now applying to less severe situations and wider phenomena. The book is interesting just because it talks about how we need to think about the idea of trauma, and whereas it used to be an objective physical definition for trauma, something like concussion, now trauma is defined as a subjective experience that anybody can claim. And so not right or wrong, but just within the context of that, it's interesting to think about how we as educators are going to handle that in the future. We are wanting to empower students to be able to learn as well as they can. And so that's why trauma is the topic that it is today. Thanks.
Okay, so like Stacy hit on, the adverse child experiences. That basically there's this test out there, like you said, that if by taking it, you can go and see what your ACE score typically is and stuff like that. And it's just a 10-question test. And it asks you these questions that fall into certain categories. And the three types of categories for the ACEs are abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Under the abuse, there's actually a couple of subcategories types. You got the physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. Under neglect, you've got physical and emotional as well. And then with household dysfunction, it falls under a like mental illness, incarcerated relatives, mother treated violently, substance abuse, and divorce. And it all has to deal with stuff. These questions are from, let's see here, when you're growing up during the first 18 years of life. And depending on what you have for these questions, for example, I'm not going to read through all of them, but for example, for the neglect, physical neglect, the question maybe is, do you often or very often feel that you did not have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, or had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you and take care of, or to take you to the doctor if needed. If you answer yes to these questions and stuff, you just add that to your ACE, and the higher up gives you to where you have the higher likelihood of the possible health risks, either between mental, physical, or behavioral health. That's pretty well all there really is on that. It goes through with the ACE test. Like I said, it breaks it down into each one of those certain categories, and it ranges. And it's kind of interesting to see, because even with the questions that were asked, a lot of people don't realize that they may actually have a higher ACE score than what you would believe when you first hear about this study. I myself took it, and I had a higher score than what I thought I would, and it's one of those things that makes you think. So it's fine.
All right, so going off of what AJ talked about, I'm going to talk about the ACE score and how it relates to health. And like he stated, ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and this includes anything from abuse and neglect, parental mental illness, substance abuse, divorce, incarceration, and domestic violence. And studies show that there is a significant relationship between the number of ACEs that a person experiences and a variety of negative outcomes, such as substance abuse and risky behaviors, and then poor physical and mental health. So a couple statistics that I took from the TED video with Nadine Harris is they were talking about when they were doing this research study, 67% of the population that they researched actually had at least one ACE score. So they had experienced some sort of abuse or neglect, a parental illness, substance abuse, divorce, incarceration, or domestic violence. And then 12% of their population that they researched had a score of 4 or more. And then during their research, they found that there's a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes, just meaning that if you have a higher ACE score, then you have a higher risk of health outcomes. What else? So they showed that a person with an ACE score of 4 or more has a relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease of 2.5 times more than someone with an ACE score of 0. It's the same for hepatitis, and then 4.5 times more for depression, 12 times for suicidality. And then students with an ACE score of 7 or more have a triple lifetime risk of lung cancer, and then 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, which happens to be the #1 killer in the US. So those are just some statistics that I pulled out of her video. Pulling it all together though, she talked about a lot of times people say, of course, people who have harder home lives have a higher risk for health conditions just because they're more likely to drink and smoke and have risky behaviors. However, Nadine stated that this is where the science actually comes in. And she talked about the exposure to early adverse effects the developing brain and bodies of children, because it affects the pleasure and reward center of the brain, and that's implicated in substance dependence. However, even if you don't engage in high-risk behavior, you're still likely or more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. So it's not just those risky behaviors that cause it. And she gave the example of the bear. And I don't know if you remember that, but she talked about if you're in a forest and you come upon a bear, let's see here. So it has to do with your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is the body and brain stress response, and it's the fight or flight. And so if you come up to a bear in the forest, your brain tells you hopefully to run. And she said that's great if you actually meet a bear in the forest. However, when the bear comes home each night, whether that's a parent or a grandparent or whatever that child is experiencing, this system is activated over and over again, and it goes from being adaptive and life-saving to maladaptive or health damaging. And it's children are especially sensitive to this as they're still developing. So those were kind of the main points in access scores and their relation to health.
I'm going to continue on with what all of my group has been talking about with the adverse child experiences. I'm going to hit a little bit on the learning brain versus the survival brain, like Stacy spoke about. That was the video from Jacob Ham. So she talked about how the learning brain is when kids have their brain open to actually learn new information, and they're peaceful and they're actually fun and curious about school. When the student is in a survival brain, that's when they're focused on that threat, like Stacy spoke about. So the things that we can do at school is for the teachers to keep students in the learning brain. They need to help make the students feel safe and supported. So that's something that teachers can be doing to help with this situation. And schools need to be making sure they have an environment where the students feel safe and protected overall. The next part I wanted to speak about was from the article on trauma-informed teaching by Angela Watson. So it talks about what trauma specifically is and what we as teachers can continue to do to help with this. Like Stacy spoke about, we have all these students in our class nowadays and they're mixed in, so you don't necessarily always know who's been affected by trauma and who hasn't. So trauma is an exceptional experience in which powerful and dangerous events overwhelm a person's capacity to cope. That's what trauma lies down to. So like everyone else said, it's not necessarily violence. It can be many other things that's going on within a student's home life. So trauma is very prominent right now, and it's affecting many children. So the problem is that schools aren't informing the teachers on how to handle it. The kids show up in your classroom, like I said, expected to work on their normal work and go through a normal school day, when emotionally they cannot even focus on what's going on in the classroom. So the article gave 5 things that should be understood about trauma. Number 1, trauma is real. A lot of the times you hear about it and maybe you just put it in the side of your brain, but everyone needs to realize that it is something that is going on in today's world. It's widespread, so you might have specific people that you think might be triggered by it, but there's so many more people that are triggered by it that we don't even know about. Trauma is toxic to the brain and can affect the learning and development, like we spoke about. Our schools should be prepared to support our kids that are affected by trauma. And lastly, children who have been impacted by trauma, they are not a hopeless cause, so they can still grow, learn, and succeed. So most people might sit them to the side and think that they are just a hopeless cause, but they have a lot more potential. They just need to be pushed to it, and they need those relationships formed. So some of the strategies that we can do as teachers in the classroom, we can be present and emotionally available. I think it's easy to fall into a habit of being so busy with your school day that you're trying the best to get everything taught throughout the day, then you're rushing to get your grading done, and a lot of times we probably seem unavailable to kids. So we need to make sure that we are emotionally available, and when you see things that you're reaching out and that you're trying to figure out what's going on. So that leads into the next one. So you need to ask kids directly what is wrong. So if you notice something wrong, you just need to straight up ask them and figure out what's going on rather than just dismiss it. You should watch for triggers and respond proactively. In her article, she talks about how when she would read a specific book, a student would hide under their desk. So clearly something in that triggered that specific student. So looking for specific things like that to help in the future. When you see an outburst, instead of going to judgment, you need to be curious. So instead of asking what's wrong with a child, you need to ask what's going on with the child to figure out what's going on within them. The last thing was you need to learn about the families in your community. if you can kind of figure out what's going on in your community and understand your students better, then that would help your school overall much better. But that's what I had for us to do as teachers.
So I think lastly, we're going to go into what our schools are doing in terms of trauma informed. I can go ahead and start and say we had a guest speaker come in for one of our professional development days last year. And I think we all took one of the ACE tests, and they walked us through it and what it means. And I do remember my ACE score was like 3 or 4, which I was really surprised about. But other than that, we're implementing MTSS this year. I know that's not technically trauma informed, but that's kind of something we're doing to make sure that students don't fall through the cracks. We also added a JAG-K program. So this also watches for students who may not be excelling in school or have big plans, or maybe they're struggling with something at home, and they put them in this JAG-K program. And what they do is they go out into the community, they talk to different industries, they look and see what jobs are available after high school, they learn communication skills. But that's really kind of all we're doing in terms of trauma right now.
Great. And at Manhattan High School, we are doing 2 of those same things. We have MTSS, which, I think we're in our 4th year of actually. We have JAG-K as well. Professional development has really been focused on this topic actually. We just had a professional development day last week where there were rotating sessions that we could choose to attend, and there were, I think, 4 sessions based on this idea of trauma-informed instruction and compassion and empathy, and what do we do when we see a student who struggles. We also, on top of that, had some teachers who last year gave talks to the whole staff about their own personal struggles in an effort to build compassion among the staff. And we also have reorganized our counseling team so that every grade level at the high school has now 2 counselors, one kind of focused on academics and one focused on social emotional health. So that's what we've done at Manhattan High.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
When your teachers got up and they talked about things that they've struggled with, was that just in front of staff, or was that in front of students as well?
Both. We had a married couple who both, who work at the high school, whose daughter died very tragically. And this happened 3 years ago. My first year was last year. But it happened only 3 years ago, and they got up and talked about the depression and the struggle to get back to regular life. And they first did it for the staff before school began. And then they actually he spoke to the student body about compassion and empathy. It was amazing. Very great.
I like that because it shows that teachers or adults also struggle with things like that too. So
absolutely. It was really cool. Yeah.
See, I wish my school was doing more in this area. We do the MTSS, and we also do the JAG program like you two spoke about. But beyond that, we don't really have anything else that we're doing. Before this module, I hadn't even heard of the adverse child experiences. When I was doing all this, and I'm really surprised because in that video that we watched, she said that trauma is the biggest unaddressed public health threat that's facing us today. So I really hope my school jumps on board with this. We had an in-service last week, and they did say that in November, our next in-service will be over trauma. So I hope that they have something good prepared, because last year was my first year and they didn't cover it at all. So we have new administration. So I hope that they really take this under their belt and do good with it.
In the Clay County district, we last year, with all the redesign and stuff like that, we implemented a trauma team. And so like, it's actually, I wouldn't say half, but probably between a quarter and half at my personal school that is of the staff that is on this trauma team. And like I said, it's throughout the whole district, and they go they go to special in services and stuff themselves and then bring stuff back for just our school stuff. But some of the stuff that we've implemented is we have a mentoring program. Every single day, the students for right before lunch or whatever go to their mentor. Say, personally, I've got 13 kids that are in my mentor class. And basically we just go over certain different things that have to deal with a lot with social emotional health, particular, but it also gives us a chance to be able to dive deeper in with those students, stuff that doesn't have to necessarily do anything with academics. I know personally, this year we're able to build those relationships, and it's amazing to where we've gotten to the point that there are a lot of students that they have gotten comfortable enough now that they're opening up, and you can see that once they're able to open up with us, that they have their school work and that stuff is improving. So like I said, we implemented this mentor program. Another simple thing that some teachers are trying out and stuff is just a simple thing as having a chair just right inside the classroom, right inside the classroom door. And what it basically is if you have a certain teacher or whatever that you feel comfortable with, or that's, kind of your safe space or whatever, even if they're having class and you're having a bad day and certain things like this, the students are able to go into that classroom and just sit, knowing that, they can just sit there for a little bit. And when the teacher has time, the teacher can come over and discuss with them, what's going on and those types of things, in order to just help open up more of that conversation with the students and get them to open up to, be able to help them through whatever situation or trauma and stuff that they have. We're trying a couple other little things too that are dealing with the trauma-informed team, but basically we're on the same page with some of you guys. We're, just doing some of that professional development. And I think too, it's just going to be one of those things that it's going to take some time, because there's a lot of information that goes along with it. So it's just a matter of getting all that information trickled down to the rest of us is kind of interesting. So
I think what you pointed out was really good with the building positive relationships, because from the kids in my classes that do have the trauma, it does seem like they kind of reach out to one person to have the relationship with. So what you talk about with your school having the chair, that's really good. They don't expect them to have that relationship with all teachers, but if they have it with one, then they can reach out to that person. I like that.
It seemed to work really well. And I've actually had some students that have ended up having a bad day, and all of a sudden I'll look over in the back of my class and there's this student there, and it's not a student I would have expected. But it's good to see that they feel comfortable enough with me that, it's just one more thing to be able to open that conversation up, and I can get over to them and see what's going on. So
That's awesome.
That is good.
All right. Well, I think that's all, and I really need to get back to conferences. Does anyone have anything else?
I'm good.
Good.